What if two colors could divide entire neighborhoods, shape music, influence movies, impact national crime policy, and cost thousands of lives? Red, blue. For more than 50 years, those colors have meant far more than fashion in parts of Los Angeles, and far beyond it. The Bloods and the Crips didn't just become rival gangs. They became symbols. Symbols of power, of survival, of fear, of identity, and of a conflict that would spread across the United States and leave a permanent mark on American culture. But here's the part most people don't understand. This story didn't begin with chaos. It began with teenagers, with neighborhoods, with protection, with communities that felt abandoned. And what happened next would reshape cities, influence law enforcement policy, inspire music that traveled around the world, and ignite cycles of violence that lasted generations. In this video, we're not just talking about rivalry. We're breaking down how the Crips formed and expanded so rapidly, why the Bloods united to fight back, how the crack epidemic transformed everything, what prison systems and policing did to intensify and sometimes reshape the conflict, how pop culture amplified the story, and why, even today, the legacy is still evolving. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it happened. And more importantly, what this history reveals about identity, opportunity, and the conditions that create cycles that are hard to break. Because this isn't just a story about gangs. It's a story about environment. And once you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. Let's begin. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. If you think the story of the Bloods and the Crips begins with red and blue bandanas, you're already starting too late. Long before the colors, long before the rivalries, long before the headlines, there was a city under pressure. To understand how two of the most infamous street organizations in American history were born, we have to step back into Los Angeles in the 1950s and 1960s. Not the Hollywood version, not the beach postcards, but the neighborhoods few cameras showed. Because the truth is this: the Bloods and the Crips didn't appear out of nowhere. They grew out of conditions, and those conditions were building for decades. After World War II, Los Angeles was booming. Factories expanded. Defense jobs multiplied. Highways carved across the landscape. Suburbs spread in every direction. To many Americans, Los Angeles symbolized opportunity and sunshine. But that opportunity wasn't shared equally. During the Great Migration, thousands of black families moved from the South to cities like Los Angeles seeking better jobs and an escape from Jim Crow segregation. They brought hope with them. But when they arrived, they found something different than what they expected. Housing discrimination limited where they could live. Banks denied mortgages in certain neighborhoods. Restrictive covenants blocked families from moving into wealthier areas. Policing was aggressive and often hostile. As a result, black communities became concentrated in areas like South Central Los Angeles and Watts. Opportunity narrowed. Jobs became harder to access. Schools were underfunded, and tension simmered. At first, the frustration was quiet, but it wouldn't stay that way. And what happened next would change everything. In August of 1965, a routine traffic stop in the Watts neighborhood escalated into something far bigger. Over 6 days, anger that had built for years erupted into widespread unrest. Buildings burned. Businesses were destroyed. Dozens of people lost their lives. Thousands were arrested. The Watts rebellion wasn't just about one incident. It was about unemployment, housing inequality, police community tension, a sense of being boxed in. For many young people growing up in South Los Angeles, this moment was formative. They saw confrontation. They saw power struggles. They saw that the city could explode. And when the smoke cleared, something else became clear. The relationship between law enforcement and many neighborhoods had fundamentally broken down. Trust was gone. In that vacuum, young people began looking elsewhere for protection, identity, and belonging. That search would shape the next decade. But before street gangs evolved into what we now recognize as Bloods and Crips, there was another influence. One that started with discipline, unity, and political purpose. And its decline would leave a dangerous gap. In the late 1960s, community-based organizations offered structure and identity to many young black men in Los Angeles. Groups promoted political awareness, community programs, neighborhood protection, education, and self-discipline. Some young people found pride and belonging there. But by the early 1970s, many of these organizations were weakened by internal conflicts, legal pressure, and leadership struggles. As structured political movements declined, something else began to fill the space. Neighborhood-based street groups started forming, not primarily political, but territorial. Protection shifted from organized activism to localized street alliances. Young people still wanted belonging, safety, status, respect, but now it was forming block by block, street by street, and sometimes corner by corner. What started as small neighborhood crews would soon evolve into something larger, much larger. And at the center of that shift was a teenager who wanted to create unity, but unintentionally sparked something far more powerful. Before the names Bloods and Crips meant anything, there were local street clubs. They had names tied to neighborhoods, apartment complexes, school affiliations. Many weren't originally focused on crime. Some were social, some were protective, some were simply groups of friends from the same area. But tension between neighborhoods was common. Territorial pride was strong. Disrespect traveled fast. And without strong institutions or trusted authority figures, conflicts escalated quickly. In areas with limited economic opportunity, status mattered, reputation mattered, and being seen as weak could carry real consequences. So young men organized, at first loosely, then more intentionally. The stage was set. All that was missing was a unifying force strong enough to connect multiple neighborhoods under one identity. That force would soon appear, and it would change Los Angeles forever. In the late 1960s, a young man named Raymond Washington began organizing youth in South Los Angeles. His initial goal wasn't to create a national network. It wasn't to start a decades-long rivalry. It was to create structure, unity, strength, protection. He began bringing together small neighborhood groups under a single banner. The name would become known worldwide. The Crips. At first, it wasn't what people imagine today. It wasn't yet a nationwide symbol. It wasn't yet deeply tied to the drug trade. It wasn't yet associated with thousands of lives lost. It was a youth movement. But rapid growth brings challenges. As more neighborhoods joined, control became harder. Different areas had different leaders, different priorities, different interpretations of what the group stood for. And that's where the story takes a turn. Because when one group grows quickly and aggressively, others feel threatened. And when smaller neighborhoods feel threatened, they don't always disappear. Sometimes they band together. And when they do, conflict becomes inevitable. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Crips expanded so rapidly, how internal fractures began almost immediately, and how a defensive alliance of smaller groups would rise in response. That alliance would choose a color, red, and once the colors were chosen, there was no going back. But before red and blue became symbols recognized around the world, there was just a city under pressure, a generation looking for identity, and a chain reaction that had already begun. Because once territorial pride mixes with economic struggle and fractured leadership, conflict doesn't stay local for long. And what started on a few blocks in South Los Angeles was about to reshape urban America. By the early 1970s, something new was happening in South Los Angeles. What had once been small neighborhood clubs was turning into something more organized, more visible, more feared. And at the center of that shift was a name that would soon echo far beyond California: the Crips. But to understand how that name became powerful, you have to understand how fast it spread and why that speed changed everything. Because growth creates influence, and influence attracts conflict. When Raymond Washington began organizing youth in South Los Angeles, the concept was simple: unite neighborhoods, stand together, project strength. In areas where young people felt unprotected and overlooked, unity had appeal. Instead of isolated street groups competing with each other, there would be alignment. Instead of scattered reputations, there would be one collective identity. And for a while, it worked. Neighborhoods began affiliating. Young men adopted a shared name. A shared presence formed. But this wasn't a corporation. There was no official structure, no centralized leadership model, no long-term blueprint. It was influence built on charisma, local respect, and momentum. And momentum can be powerful, especially in communities where reputation travels faster than rules. One of the most important shifts during this time wasn't about violence. It was about identity. For many young people, being part of something larger felt empowering. It offered belonging, recognition, a sense of purpose, protection through numbers. In neighborhoods with limited economic mobility, identity can become currency. Respect becomes status, and status becomes protection. The Crips name began to represent strength, but strength invites challenge. And when one group grows rapidly, others begin to feel overshadowed, especially smaller neighborhoods that had no interest in being absorbed. And this is where the story begins to fracture. As more neighborhoods adopted the Crips name, they didn't all operate the same way. Some were tight-knit, some were loosely organized, some were disciplined, some were chaotic. There was no central control system strong enough to manage dozens of local leaders. So what happened? Each neighborhood operated independently under the same umbrella. That meant internal disagreements, territorial disputes, personal conflicts. In some cases, Crips-affiliated neighborhoods began clashing with other Crips-affiliated neighborhoods. Internal tension was already forming, and the expansion was still accelerating. The more the name spread, the less unified it became. And when power becomes decentralized without coordination, instability follows. By the early to mid-1970s, the Crips name carried weight. In some neighborhoods, it carried fear. Smaller independent groups began to feel pressure. Some were encouraged to join, others resisted. And resistance often led to confrontation. The key shift during this period wasn't just physical conflict. It was perception. The perception that one growing force was dominating the landscape. When perception shifts, alliances begin forming in response. And that response would create the second half of the rivalry. But before we get there, we need to understand something critical. The Crips weren't originally built as a nationwide organization. They were local, territorial, block-based. Yet within a few short years, they had become the most dominant street identity in parts of Los Angeles. That dominance didn't go unnoticed, and it didn't go unchallenged. As tensions grew between Crips-affiliated neighborhoods and those that refused to align, clashes increased. Retaliation cycles formed. Small incidents escalated. Reputation became everything. And once reputations are tied to survival, backing down becomes dangerous. In communities where formal protection systems were distrusted, young people enforced their own codes. Disrespect demanded response. Territory demanded defense. Affiliation demanded loyalty. And loyalty often meant escalation. The speed of expansion had created pressure. Now that pressure was turning into confrontation. Here's the part many people misunderstand. The Bloods did not begin as an equal rival from the start. They began as a response, a reaction to the rapid growth and aggressive reputation of the Crips. Smaller neighborhoods that had refused to align realized something. Standing alone wasn't sustainable. If unity created strength for one side, unity could create strength for the other. And so conversations began, quietly at first, then more intentionally. Neighborhoods that once operated separately began forming defensive alliances, not to dominate, but to survive. And once those alliances formed, the landscape changed permanently. Because now, there were two sides. Not dozens of independent groups. Two banners. Two identities. Two colors. And once colors entered the picture, symbolism amplified everything. Because colors are simple, easy to recognize, easy to represent, easy to rally behind. Blue and red. What started as neighborhood organization was evolving into symbolic rivalry. And symbols travel faster than explanations. As years passed, stories about the early days became exaggerated. Media narratives simplified complex social dynamics into good versus bad, red versus blue. But the reality was more complicated. This wasn't born from a single moment. It wasn't triggered by one fight. It wasn't planned as a decades-long war. It was a chain reaction. Economic pressure, institutional distrust, youth identity, rapid expansion, fragmented leadership, defensive alliances, each layer building on the one before it. And once retaliation cycles begin, they're incredibly difficult to stop. Because each generation inherits the history of the last, even if they weren't there when it started. And that inheritance would only grow heavier in the decade to come. Because the 1980s would introduce something that transformed street identity into something far more profitable and far more destructive. The crack cocaine epidemic. What had been territorial rivalry would soon intersect with a booming underground economy. And when money enters conflict, the stakes multiply. By the early 1970s, the balance of power in South Los Angeles had shifted. The Crips had expanded rapidly. Their name carried influence, fear, and visibility. Smaller neighborhoods that chose not to align often found themselves under pressure. Some conflicts were territorial, others were personal, but the result was the same. Isolation became dangerous. And when isolation becomes dangerous, alliances begin. The Bloods were not born from a single founder or one central meeting. They were formed through necessity. A network of neighborhoods that refused to join the Crips began organizing together. What started as defensive coordination slowly evolved into something stronger. What began as survival would become identity. In areas like Compton and other parts of Los Angeles County, independent groups realized they could not stand alone against a rapidly expanding force. Conversations happened between neighborhood leaders. Agreements were made. Lines were drawn. The logic was simple. If unity gave strength to one side, unity could protect the other. At first, the alliance was not polished. It was not branded. It was not highly structured. It was practical. If one neighborhood was attacked, others would respond. If one block was pressured, support would arrive. But over time, something deeper formed. Shared opposition created shared identity. Shared identity created loyalty. And loyalty solidified into a name. The Bloods. Once the alliance solidified, symbolism followed. Colors became identifiers. Red became associated with the Bloods. Blue was already associated with the Crips. These visual markers made affiliation instantly recognizable. And that changed everything. Before colors, identification required familiarity. After colors, it required only sight. A hat, a bandana, a jacket, shoelaces, graffiti. Symbols transformed local disputes into visible territory markers. And visible territory increases tension. Because now conflict wasn't just about neighborhoods. It was about representation. When someone wore red or blue, they weren't just representing themselves. They were representing a collective history. And collective identity amplifies personal actions. One incident no longer stayed personal. It became symbolic. Like the Crips, the Bloods did not operate as a single centralized organization. They were a federation of sets, individual neighborhoods with their own leadership, culture, and internal rules. That decentralized structure made them adaptable, but it also meant inconsistencies. Some sets were tightly organized. Some were loosely structured. Some prioritized protection. Others were more aggressive. Without one unified chain of command, decision-making varied. Retaliation decisions could be made locally. Escalation could happen quickly. The rivalry intensified because each neighborhood acted autonomously under a shared banner. And once autonomy meets rivalry, unpredictability follows. By the mid to late 1970s, clashes between Blood-affiliated neighborhoods and Crip-affiliated neighborhoods were becoming more frequent. Retaliation became routine. An incident in one area triggered a response in another. That response triggered another retaliation. The cycle fed itself, and each side believed it was responding defensively. This is how long-term rivalries harden. Not through one event, but through repetition. Each generation of members inherited the narratives of past conflicts. Stories were passed down. Names of neighborhoods became loaded with meaning. Old incidents shaped new decisions. And over time, history became motivation. As violence increased, media coverage followed. News reports simplified the conflict. Red versus blue. Two sides locked in war. Images of bandanas and graffiti became shorthand for danger. But simplified narratives miss context. They rarely addressed the economic instability of the neighborhoods involved. They rarely examined the decline of manufacturing jobs in Los Angeles. They rarely discussed overcrowded housing, underfunded schools, or strained community police relationships. Instead, the story became color-coded conflict. And when a complex issue is simplified, solutions become harder to find. Public fear grew. Law enforcement response intensified. And pressure from outside institutions increased. But pressure does not always dissolve conflict. Sometimes it strengthens group identity instead. If the 1970s were about identity and rivalry, the 1980s introduced a new variable: the crack cocaine epidemic. This period dramatically altered the structure of street organizations across Los Angeles and beyond. What had been primarily territorial conflicts now intersected with underground economies. Illegal drug distribution created financial incentives. Territory now meant more than pride. It meant profit. And profit changes behavior. Access to money increased access to weapons. Competition intensified. Internal disputes over distribution and control emerged within sets, not just between them. Some neighborhoods became more business-oriented. Others remained focused on rivalry. But the environment had changed permanently. Conflict was no longer only about respect. It was about revenue. As the 1980s progressed, both Blood and Crip identities spread beyond California. Some members relocated. Some affiliations spread through prison systems. Some identities were adopted by groups in other states. The rivalry, once hyperlocal, became national. But as it expanded, it also changed. In many cities outside Los Angeles, local dynamics shaped how the identities operated. Some adopted the names without inheriting the original history. Others maintained stronger ties to California roots. The result was fragmentation within expansion. Shared colors, shared names, different realities. One of the least discussed aspects of this history is internal conflict. Crips clashed with Crips. Bloods clashed with Bloods. Disputes over territory, leadership, or personal grievances did not disappear simply because of shared affiliation. In some cases, internal conflicts were as intense as external ones. This is what decentralized power structures often produce. Loyalty is local first, affiliation second. And when local interests clash, affiliation does not always prevent violence. Lost in headlines and simplified narratives are the human consequences. Families disrupted, young lives lost, communities carrying generational trauma. Many individuals who joined were teenagers. Some were seeking protection. Some were influenced by older peers. Some were navigating unstable environments with limited alternatives. Over time, many former members would reflect on how quickly identity can become destiny, how quickly small conflicts can spiral, how difficult it becomes to exit once loyalty is established, and how cycles of retaliation trap entire neighborhoods. By the 1990s, the red versus blue rivalry had become one of the most recognized symbols of American street conflict. Music referenced it. Movies dramatized it. Media sensationalized it. But beneath the symbolism remained the original elements. Economic instability, territorial protection, youth identity, fragmented leadership, cycles of retaliation. And those elements do not disappear simply because awareness increases. They require structural change, community investment, and generational healing. The rivalry between the Bloods and Crips did not begin as a national phenomenon. It began as neighborhood organization, defensive alliances, and rapid expansion. But once identity hardens and conflict repeats, the story becomes larger than its origins. In the next chapter, we examine how law enforcement strategies, incarceration policies, and the prison system reshaped both organizations, and how the 1990s introduced attempts at truces that briefly shifted the trajectory. By the late 1980s, the rivalry between Bloods and Crips had moved beyond neighborhood disputes. It had become a national concern. Violence was rising in parts of Los Angeles. The crack cocaine epidemic had intensified competition. Media coverage amplified fear. Politicians responded with tougher rhetoric. Law enforcement agencies escalated their strategies. The conflict was no longer just between neighborhoods. It was between street organizations and the state. And that shift would reshape everything. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, policing strategies in Los Angeles became more aggressive and more visible. Specialized gang units expanded. Gang databases were created. Sweeps and large-scale operations became common. Enhanced sentencing laws were introduced. The goal was clear: suppress gang activity through enforcement. In theory, removing key figures and increasing prison time would weaken organizations. In practice, the results were complicated. Arrests increased. Incarceration rates surged. But decentralized organizations are resilient. When one individual is removed, another often fills the gap. Leadership structures were rarely centralized enough to collapse from a single arrest. Instead of dissolving affiliations, enforcement sometimes reinforced them. Shared incarceration created shared identity, and prisons became new organizing spaces. When members from different neighborhoods were incarcerated together, dynamics shifted. Inside prison walls, survival required alignment. Street rivalries did not disappear, but they were reshaped. Larger racial and organizational groupings often took priority. Prison politics sometimes unified individuals who would have been enemies on the street. This had two long-term effects. First, networks expanded. Members from different regions built connections that extended beyond their original neighborhoods. Second, strategies evolved. Communication between incarcerated members and those on the outside created feedback loops. In some cases, prison alliances reduced certain street conflicts. In others, they intensified them once individuals were released. Prisons did not simply punish activity. They became part of the ecosystem. One of the most significant turning points came in 1992. After the acquittal of officers involved in the beating of Rodney King, Los Angeles erupted in unrest. For several days, the city experienced widespread violence, looting, and destruction. But something unexpected happened within parts of South Los Angeles. Leaders from rival sets initiated a truce. Most notably, in Watts, members of blood-affiliated and Crip-affiliated neighborhoods agreed to reduce violence against each other. The logic was simple but powerful. Continued internal conflict only weakened the community further. The truce was not perfect. It was not universal, but it demonstrated something important. Rivalry was not inevitable. It could be paused. The Watts Truce of 1992 remains one of the most referenced peace efforts in the history of the rivalry. Community leaders, local organizers, and influential neighborhood figures met face-to-face. They negotiated terms. They established communication channels. They emphasized shared interests. Violence in certain areas dropped significantly in the months that followed. The truce proved that dialogue was possible. It showed that long-standing conflict could be interrupted. But maintaining peace required consistent effort, trust, and broader structural support. And that support was uneven. Economic conditions did not immediately improve. Policing tensions remained high. Opportunities for youth were still limited. Without systemic change, local truces carried heavy pressure. By the mid to late 1990s, violent crime rates began declining across the United States, including in Los Angeles. The reasons are still debated among researchers. Some point to demographic shifts, others to changes in policing, others to economic growth, others to reductions in crack cocaine markets. What is clear is that the intensity of street violence in many areas decreased compared to peak years in the early 1990s. But decline does not equal disappearance. Affiliations remained. History remained. Identity remained. The rivalry had been reshaped, not erased. During this same period, hip-hop music and film brought national attention to life in Los Angeles neighborhoods. Some artists described the realities of violence and poverty. Some emphasized identity and representation. Some were accused of glorifying conflict. Others were seen as documenting lived experience. The rivalry entered pop culture. Red and blue became visual shorthand not just for conflict, but for authenticity and street credibility in certain artistic spaces. This visibility had dual effects. On one hand, it created broader awareness of social conditions. On the other, it sometimes amplified stereotypes. Complex realities were often reduced to simplified narratives. And simplified narratives can distort public understanding. Throughout the 1990s, federal and state policies increased sentencing severity for gang-related activity. Three-strikes laws, gang enhancement charges, expanded surveillance powers. These policies significantly increased incarceration rates. Communities already facing economic strain experienced additional disruption as more residents were imprisoned for longer periods. Families were separated. Economic stability became harder to maintain. Cycles of poverty deepened. The intention was deterrence. The long-term impact included generational consequences. When large portions of a community cycle through incarceration, recovery becomes difficult. Despite challenges, community-led solutions continued. Local organizations focused on conflict mediation, youth mentorship, job training programs, after-school initiatives, violence interruption strategies. Some former members became outreach workers. Some dedicated themselves to breaking cycles they had once been part of. These efforts rarely made national headlines, but they played a crucial role in reducing violence in specific neighborhoods. Peace was not achieved through one event. It was built through continuous effort. By the early 2000s, the Bloods and Crips were no longer solely defined by early street wars. They had become complex social networks with varying structures across different cities. In some places, rivalry remained intense. In others, it had softened. In many areas, Internal disputes outweighed traditional red versus blue lines. The narrative had evolved. What began as neighborhood organization in the late 1960s had become a decades-long cycle shaped by economics, policy, culture, and identity. And the story was far from over. In the next chapter, we'll examine how the 2000s and 2010s reshaped the landscape again. Through social media, changing crime patterns, evolving policing strategies, and new generational attitudes toward identity and affiliation. By the early 2000s, the world had changed. The streets were still there. The history was still there. The colors were still there. But technology was transforming how identity, conflict, and reputation worked. For decades, neighborhood reputation spread by word of mouth. It traveled through physical space, block by block, school by school, prison yard by prison yard. Now it could travel instantly, across cities, across states, across the world. The internet didn't create rivalry, but it changed how rivalry operated. Social media platforms introduced a new arena. Affiliation, once primarily physical and local, became digital and visible. Photos, videos, music clips, live streams. Identity was no longer just worn, it was broadcast. That visibility had consequences. Where older generations navigated conflict face-to-face, newer generations sometimes encountered it online first. Disrespect, which once required proximity, could now happen publicly and permanently. A comment, a video, a post, a lyric. Digital interactions sometimes triggered real-world consequences. The line between online and offline blurred. Reputation, always important, became quantifiable through views, shares, and attention. And attention can escalate behavior. By the 2000s and 2010s, hip-hop had become a global industry. Artists from neighborhoods historically associated with Blood or Crip identities gained national and international followings. Some openly referenced affiliation. Others distanced themselves from it. Some used color symbolism subtly. Others embraced it directly. Music became both opportunity and risk. On one hand, it offered a path out of poverty. On the other, public visibility sometimes intensified local tensions. Lyrics could be interpreted as insults. Videos could be seen as territorial claims. Public disputes between artists sometimes reflected deeper neighborhood rivalries. Yet music also humanized communities often portrayed only through crime statistics. It told stories of struggle, ambition, trauma, and survival. The same platform that amplified conflict also amplified voice. One major shift in the modern era is that the original red versus blue binary became less dominant in some areas. Internal conflicts grew more common than traditional rivalries in certain cities. Local disputes over money, social media clout, or personal issues sometimes outweighed historical alliances. In some neighborhoods, younger generations had less direct connection to the original reasons the rivalry began. They inherited the identity, but not always the context. That inheritance without historical grounding sometimes made conflict feel symbolic rather than strategic. At the same time, in other areas, the rivalry remained deeply entrenched. The modern landscape became uneven. There was no single narrative anymore. Policing strategies evolved alongside technology. Social media posts were monitored. Online activity became evidence. Digital communication created trails. Gang databases expanded. Predictive policing models were introduced in some cities. Surveillance technology increased. This raised complex debates. Supporters argued it prevented violence. Critics argued it criminalized association and increased over-policing in marginalized communities. The relationship between communities and law enforcement remained strained in many areas. Technology did not eliminate mistrust. It often intensified it. While the crack epidemic had defined the 1980s, the 2000s brought different economic pressures. Manufacturing jobs had long declined. Service economies expanded. Housing prices in Los Angeles surged. Gentrification reshaped neighborhoods. Longtime residents were displaced. Cultural landmarks disappeared. Economic inequality widened. In some areas, reduced street violence coincided with rising cost of living. In others, poverty persisted without the same level of national attention. The environment that had originally fueled neighborhood organization, limited opportunity, and economic exclusion did not vanish. It evolved, and economic pressure continues to influence youth decisions. modern violence prevention increasingly relies on community-based strategies. Former members now serve as mediators. Violence interruption programs intervene before retaliation cycles escalate. Local nonprofits focus on mentorship, education, and employment access. These efforts are often underfunded, but they represent a major shift in philosophy. Instead of purely punitive approaches, some cities have embraced prevention and intervention. The idea is simple. If identity is built on belonging, provide belonging elsewhere. If conflict is fueled by isolation, build connection. If retaliation is driven by communication breakdown, create dialogue. Progress is uneven, but these strategies acknowledge that enforcement alone cannot resolve generational conflict. Older generations often remember the most violent years. The late 1980s, the early 1990s, the height of crack-era competition. Younger generations grew up in a different environment. Some inherited stories more than lived experiences. Others still navigate active conflict zones. Some seek to distance themselves entirely from historical affiliations. The generational divide shapes identity differently. For some, colors remain central. For others, they are secondary to neighborhood pride or personal reputation. In many places, the old map of alliances has shifted, but history still matters. Because history shapes perception, and perception influences behavior. What began in Los Angeles decades ago now exists in various forms across the United States and internationally. But replication is never identical. In different cities, local conditions shape how affiliations function. In some places, names are adopted without direct connection to original neighborhoods. In others, migration patterns preserved closer ties. The result is complexity. There is no single structure, no single leader, no single narrative. Just layered histories intersecting with local realities. At its core, the story of the Bloods and Crips is not just about rivalry. It is about youth searching for protection, communities navigating economic exclusion, institutions struggling to respond, identity forming under pressure, cycles of retaliation hardening over time. In the modern era, the question is no longer simply who controls which block. It is whether cycles can be permanently broken. Whether identity can evolve without violence, whether opportunity can replace survival-based affiliation, and whether history can be acknowledged without being endlessly repeated. In the final chapter, we will step back and examine the broader lessons of this history, what it reveals about power, poverty, policy, identity, and the possibility of change. More than 50 years after the first neighborhood alliances formed in South Los Angeles, the legacy of the Bloods and Crips is still unfolding. What began as localized youth organization in the late 1960s became one of the most recognized street rivalries in American history. But history simplifies. It compresses. It dramatizes. It reduces decades into symbols. Red and blue. Two colors that came to represent something much larger than fabric. To understand the legacy, we have to step back from the symbolism and look at the deeper patterns. Because the rivalry is not just a story about gangs. It is a story about environment. No organization forms in a vacuum. The early growth of neighborhood groups in Los Angeles happened during a period of economic decline, racial segregation, industrial job loss, and strained relationships between communities and law enforcement. When opportunity narrows, identity fills the space. When protection feels unreliable, people create their own systems. When young people feel unseen, they build visibility through affiliation. The Bloods and Crips were not anomalies. They were responses. Responses to instability. Responses to marginalization. Responses to fear. Responses to lack of access. The tragedy is not just that conflict followed. The tragedy is that the underlying conditions persisted for so long. Because when conditions remain, cycles continue. Over the decades, thousands of lives were altered. Some were lost. Some were incarcerated. Some were displaced. Some carried trauma into adulthood. Entire neighborhoods experienced generational impact. Children grew up hearing stories of rival sets. Families navigated invisible territorial lines. Communities internalized narratives about danger and survival. And cycles of retaliation can become self-sustaining. One incident justifies another. History becomes explanation. Explanation becomes motivation. Breaking that pattern requires more than enforcement. It requires interruption at the level of belief. One of the most powerful forces throughout this story is identity. Identity gave young people belonging. It gave protection. It gave pride. But identity also created division. It hardened boundaries. It demanded loyalty. Belonging is powerful, so powerful that people will defend it even when it harms them. The question moving forward is not whether identity should exist. It is what kind of identity is nurtured. Neighborhood pride does not have to mean hostility. Community loyalty does not have to mean exclusion. But those shifts require new narratives. In the decades since the rivalry began, music, film, and media have shaped how the world views it. Some portrayals focused on violence. Others highlighted resilience. Some amplified stereotypes. Others challenged them. The cultural footprint is undeniable. But culture can evolve. Many artists and public figures who grew up in affected neighborhoods now speak about peace, economic empowerment, and community rebuilding. They acknowledge history without glorifying it. They use visibility to shift direction. This is part of the modern transformation. Law enforcement strategies, incarceration policies, and sentencing laws played a significant role in shaping the trajectory of the rivalry. Aggressive policing disrupted activity in some cases. Incarceration removed individuals from neighborhoods, but it also destabilized families and created new networks inside prison systems. Policy can suppress behavior, but it cannot replace opportunity. The long-term solution to street conflict is rarely found in punishment alone. It is found in education, in employment pathways, in stable housing, in accessible mental health resources, in trust between communities and institutions. Where those factors improve, violence tends to decline. Where they deteriorate, instability grows. In many parts of Los Angeles, violence is significantly lower than during peak years of the early 1990s. Community-based intervention programs have expanded. Former rivals have participated in dialogue efforts. Younger generations are redefining what respect and success look like. That does not mean the rivalry has disappeared, but it does mean it is not frozen in time. Some neighborhoods that once saw constant retaliation now prioritize economic growth. Some former members dedicate their lives to preventing others from repeating their paths. Some families actively challenge inherited narratives of hostility. Change is uneven, but it exists. The biggest misunderstanding about the Bloods and Crips is that the story is simply about good versus bad. It is not. It is about systems and survival. It is about environment and response. It is about identity formed under pressure. It is about how cycles can outlive their original causes. Reducing the story to color-coded conflict ignores the deeper forces that shaped it. And ignoring those forces makes it easier for similar cycles to form elsewhere. Because this is not just a Los Angeles story. It is a universal pattern. Where opportunity collapses and identity becomes protection, similar dynamics can emerge. The future of this history depends on multiple factors: economic investment, educational access, community leadership, policy reform, generational mindset shifts. The rivalry will not disappear because it is discussed. It fades when the need for it fades. When young people feel protected without affiliation. When opportunity replaces survival-based identity. When community pride does not require opposition. The colors may always carry history. But history does not have to dictate the future. More than half a century ago, small neighborhood groups formed in response to instability. Those groups grew. They fractured. They aligned. They fought. They spread. They evolved. The story is complex. It is painful. It is layered. It is still unfolding. But beneath the headlines and symbolism is a deeper lesson. When communities are supported, cycles weaken. When they are neglected, cycles harden. The Bloods and Crips rivalry is not just a story about conflict. It is a mirror reflecting what happens when identity becomes a substitute for opportunity. And it is also proof that even long-standing cycles can shift when conditions change. The question is not whether history exists. The question is what we choose to build next. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.